welcome to our first faculty corner of 2019. We have with us today Dr. Paul Jenkins, Assistant Professor of Pharmacology and Psychiatry, and Josie Libertucci, a postdoc in the Internal Medicine Department. She's in Vince Young's lab. The purpose of this particular faculty corner is going to be to talk about what it takes to start up your lab. So Josie is going to really take the wheel, and she's going to guide us through a conversation of all about all of these things that go into starting up your lab. I have one housekeeping announcement. All of the food you're eating, obviously, but the wrappers and also the plates are compostable. When you leave, there's a compost bin outside for you to deposit those. Enjoy.
Great, thanks Maggie. So good afternoon everyone. Before we begin, could you just give me a show of hands? Who's a graduate student in this audience? So just a few of you, and then who's a postdoc? Great. There we go.
Yes.
So thank you to everyone who RSVP'd and who sent in those wonderful questions. Based on your questions, I kind of divided this session into different categories. So we're going to start with just a basic background of Paul's training. Then we're going to get into his postdoc years, really focusing on when he thought he was ready for the market, why, like how do you know when you're ready for the market. Then we're not really going to discuss the whole interview progress because they've had many faculty corners regarding that previously. So we're going to really spend the majority of this time talking about that transition from a postdoc to faculty. What do you need to do and how do you start your lab? We do have a hard stop at 1 p.m. and so I'm going to try and have everything finished by 12:55. So I will be moving the conversation along and I will also probably cut off questions at a certain point in time. Okay, so great. Hey Paul, let's get started. So where did you do your undergraduate degree?
So I trained here, actually, at the University of Michigan. So I got my bachelor's degree in general biology. Here, my first year was our national championship football year. It's been all downhill ever since. So I actually did my undergrad training and my PhD both here.
Oh, fantastic. Where did you do your postdoc?
So I did my postdoc at Duke University with Dr. Van Bennett. He was an HHMI investigator there. I was there for about 4.5 years.
Okay, and so you only did one postdoc?
Correct.
So how many years into your postdoc did you start applying for faculty positions?
So I guess it was about 3.5 years in that I started, or maybe even closer to 4 that I started applying. It was, as you guys probably know from the other series you've had, the job postings tend to happen in the fall. So it was that fall of 2014 that I started applying.
So how did you know that you were ready to go on the market, or did you not know and you just decided to try?
I think this is a challenging question. This is going to be a different answer for everybody, but one of the things that I've heard and the advice that I've gotten over the years is you know that you're ready when you start to butt heads with your mentor and you start to want to take things in your own direction, right?
Okay.
And so, you know, you've gotten your training from your mentor, you know what their lab wants to do. You've got some new ideas that you want to test and you want to start developing those. And it comes normally on the heels of, you know, some publications coming out and you've got some momentum going.
Sure.
Now's the time to go. And I think, you know, for some, everything falls into place and it's more clear than for others. But it's, you know, it's sort of an unsatisfying answer, but you just sort of know.
Sure.
When it's time.
Sure. And so you said you knew you were ready when you wanted to take your research in your own direction. Did you have a chance to do that in your postdoc, or was that strictly reserved for when you had your own lab?
So my situation was a little bit unique because my postdoc mentor is in essentially phased retirement right now.
Okay.
And so in my situation, finding something to set myself apart from my mentor was not as much of an issue as it is for some.
Yeah.
It's something certainly you have to be aware of. You know, how do you carve something out that's going to be
Yeah.
yours? When is that time available to do that?
Yeah.
You know, experimental time and thinking time that you can carve that out. And in my situation, you know, my mentor was very generous and allowed me to take some things with me that I had started during my postdoc.
Great. And so how many years were you on the market?
So I actually, my first place I applied was here.
Okay.
And it was
So 100% success rate?
I had about 20 other applications out.
Okay.
And I heard from here first.
Okay.
And I withdrew my other applications
Oh.
because I bleed maize and blue and this was the right place for me and my family.
I'm not sure if you've noticed his socks,
Yeah,
but...
my Michigan socks. But
Wonderful.
Yeah, so it was
Yeah.
one season. I started that fall,
Great.
and I accepted this job. I started in March, actually, which is a bit unusual. Normally you start the following fall, but I was a little bit early.
Okay, so you were offered your position in the fall.
Yeah.
You said, and then you started in March.
Yes.
So from that time, from the fall to March, what did you do? What were some of the things that you did to prepare yourself for your own lab?
So actually, I saw one of the questions on there was, when should you start preparing?
Yeah.
And I think you should start even before you accept your postdoc if you can. Because one of the things that's really important is finding out what your mentor's stance is on taking stuff with you, right? And this depends a lot on the stage of the mentor's career, right? A very senior person with a bunch of different topics going on in the lab might be a little bit more open to you taking something with you. A brand new PI, that's a bit of a challenge, when the lab only has a couple of things going. Letting one of those go is hard. And so if you have the ability, and I know some of you are postdocs and even very senior postdocs, if you haven't had that conversation, have it today or soon, because it's a very important question. It's an uncomfortable conversation sometimes,
Yes.
but you're going to have it. And the sooner you know the answer, the better it's going to be. So I think I started right away. During my interview, I asked my mentor what his stance was on taking things, and he said, if you develop something that is sort of your own, then I'm more than willing for you to take that with you. But what constitutes something that's your own is going to differ
when you're under
from-
the umbrella of your PI.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so outside of that, sort of the last 6 months as I started interviewing and I knew that I was getting ready to go, there were a lot of sort of concrete steps that I took. There are things that you don't realize when you're in a lab, because the lab was already built and you go in and, okay, I'm just going to use the DNA imager and I'm going to go over the incubator and I'm just going to use all these things that already exist.
Yeah.
And then you get to your lab and it's an open room with nothing in it. And you say, how did we have that set up again? I can't. So somebody had recommended to me, I actually went around the lab and I took pictures of everything.
Is that allowed? Like,
Oh, yeah.
Did you talk to your PI about that, or is that?
I'm not sure I did. I don't
Okay.
think he would have minded. It's probably a good idea, but I mean, all I'm taking pictures of sort of model numbers and the way it's set up
Sure.
and all these sorts of things. And that really helps because then you get to your lab and you want to put your first order together and you can't even think of what company the incubators were that you liked and all these sorts of things. So that was really a useful thing that I started doing. And I was in a situation where the projects I was taking with me didn't need a lot of reagent development. So I didn't have to work on those things, and so that might be different for somebody who's carving out a new area.
Yeah. So you mentioned that it's extremely important to have that talk with your mentor about what you're going to take with you. Do you have any tips on how to approach that conversation?
Well, I think all of us know that postdocs need to have something that they're going to start their lab with. And so, in theory, since our job is to progress our trainees and get them to that next level, hopefully it's a conversation that PIs want to have. Of course, you all know each of your individual mentors has a different personality, and so I think you really have to base it off of your mentor's personality. Some are very open and can have that conversation easily. So it's hard to give a sort of concrete answer to that.
Sure.
I think it depends a lot on your mentor. My mentor, for example, I knew there were days when he was in a great mood, and that was the day that I would talk to him about it.
When you just got that grant.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. But yeah, I think you have to sort of play that by ear.
Okay.
With your mentor, and just say, listen, this has been a really great training experience, and I really would like to take this research in this direction, and I was wondering if that would be okay for me to work on this, and in some situations I've heard what I would consider horror stories of mentors that said, well, you can do it, but we're going to keep doing it too, and we're going to crush you. And, hopefully that's not the experience that our trainees here have. I mean, eating your young is not ideal in a science setting, but it does happen,
Do you have any advice for if that conversation goes sour?
I think having other senior mentors is always good. For me, I leaned very heavily on my PhD mentor during my postdoc. I also leaned heavily on my now chair because she was my co-mentor in grad school.
Great.
So I think having other senior mentors really helps because in the throes of everything and you're a postdoc and you're stressed and everything is hard and then this happens and for me, I would get very emotional about it or, very upset or something. And
Yeah.
it was nice to bounce these things off of other senior people. And sometimes they would say, listen, you gotta let that roll off or you gotta toughen up. And other times they would say, well, that's not right and you need to have a conversation about that. So I think having other sets of ears to bounce things off of was really helpful.
Absolutely. Great. So I think this is a nice stopping point. I'm going to open up the floor for a couple of questions, but these questions I really want them, if anyone has a question specifically about how to carve out your own research or your own model while you're a postdoc. Any questions about that? Yes.
Well, I wanted to ask, I guess how comfortable you felt with the transition. So I'm a graduate student now, and kind of seeing myself in a position where I'm taking ownership of my own project independently. Like, how comfortable did you feel with that, the transition from grad school to postdoc versus postdoc to a faculty position?
I think grad school to postdoc was really easy because I went from an olfactory cilia signaling lab to a cytoskeletal neuroscience lab that had really nothing to do with each other. So I think that transition was pretty simple. The other transition certainly had its awkward moments, and I think it still sometimes does. You're trying to make your own identity without stepping on the toes of other people, and appreciating what your mentor has done for you, but at the same time developing your own stuff. And so it can be awkward at times, but I think if you're careful in your selection of your mentor, and this is something that you talk about when you're interviewing, hopefully it will be less of an issue. And this is one thing I did do is I called previous trainees, previous postdocs from my postdoc lab, and I asked what was it really like? Because you hear a lot of things when everyone's standing around talking and it's sort of in public, but you can call them and say, hey, was this a good environment? Did this person have your best interest at heart? And try to at least minimize that chance. For you senior postdocs, you guys are already kind of stuck, but hopefully you have great mentors, and I'm sure most of you.
Great. I'll take one more question on this topic. Okay.
And I will say, actually, before we move on, if you're thinking about carving out your niche, the other thing I would recommend is start that as soon as possible, too. You may not start physically working on it, but go to every seminar you can. You never know when you're going to see something that, oh man, this would be really cool with the immune synapse or something totally different than what you're working on. Just expose yourself to as much as you can. Lots of different departmental seminars, go to lunches with the speakers. Something may click that you say, you know what, I'm going to put a pin in that and I'm going to come back to that later. I think this is a really cool unanswered question that I could easily spin off from my current mentor without stepping on toes. And even if you might not be making the plasmids to do the experiments, it's a set of ideas that you could then use to start a new area.
Great. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to move on to that first day when you were a PI. So day one, what did you do? What were the first things that you did to set up your lab?
I bought a lot of Sharpies. Yeah, it's really daunting when you show up and they say, here's a checkbook and a big open space. We got you some nice new chairs. And now you need to get started. And the first thing I started doing was talking to the big company reps to start setting up my initial order. I mean, the things that you're going to need, your incubators, your microscopes, and all these things. And one thing you'll find is you are their best friend in the world when you first start. They will promise you the world, and they will give it to you for that first order, and then you're just everybody else after that. So grind on them for that first order. Play them off of each other. I'm the world's wimpiest negotiator. I ground them to powder. I mean, just play them. They're going to give me 10% off and free shipping and all these free gifts. What can you do for me to get me? And then I would go cry in a corner because I was very nervous after that. But that's what I started doing right away. Because a lot of these things, it was a bit of a surprise how long some of this stuff took to come in. And I see this now. We've hired a bunch of new faculty in our department. And they're sort of up in my office all the time right now because they're waiting for boxes to come in. And so sometimes if you have big equipment, you can actually get it ordered before you even show up on campus. So if there are specific things, not pipettes or things that you can get in a day, but if there's a special microscope or a special plate reader you need, the university will often release a short code for you or just order it on their short code and transfer it to your account later. And that can help you from day one because really your ultimate goal is to get people in lab as quickly as you can and get the projects rolling. And no rotation student wants to come in and open boxes and stock shelves, right? It's not really fair to them. It's not useful for you as a recruiting tool. So getting stuff in as quickly as possible was sort of the first thing.
Yeah, okay.
And I think the second thing was my website.
Okay.
Because everybody does everything electronically now. When rotation students come through, they click through the lab websites, and if you have a Twitter egg for a picture and no lab website, they just move on. So I think that's another really important thing.
Did you make your own website, or did you hire someone?
I did hire someone to do it. It was a friend of mine, so he did it
Okay.
for cheap, but it's a WordPress site.
Okay.
My most important thing when I was setting it up was, can I keep this up to date easily?
Yes.
Because we all know the websites where you log on and their last publication was 1992, and you think, well, that's a little weird.
Yeah.
So, it's something that I was able to go quickly. In fact, we updated some pictures today. We had a new lab photo.
Nice.
Something that you can keep up to date.
Great. So going back to a budget, so did you ever receive any training about how to make a budget?
Absolutely.
So how did you learn how to make a budget?
On the fly.
Okay.
I set up with our administrative staff, and we're lucky here. We have pretty good administrative support. A lot of my other friends sort of do this thing on their own.
Yeah.
We started ordering, and after things sort of stabilized, I just kept track of sort of what our monthly average spend was, and then we would just forecast out, at this rate, how long is it going to last? And I've been sort of adjusting from there. You have months where you spend a lot, you have to buy a bunch of reagents and antibodies, and you have other months that are lean. So what I did is I did a rolling 12-month average of our monthly spend, including salaries and anything that was coming off of the grant. And then just forecast that out to zero and beyond, it turns out.
Okay. What were some unexpected costs that you encountered when you were starting up your lab?
So I didn't have too much
Okay.
on the costs that were unexpected, aside from how fast animal costs add up.
Okay.
So we have a relatively large mouse colony, seems to grow every day. I get an email from ULAM saying it's too big, it's too big. But yeah, that's something to pay attention to, and every university's per diem costs are different, and ours are actually not that bad compared to a lot of places, but other places are much, much cheaper. So it's something to look for, especially if you're going to have a large animal colony when you're interviewing for jobs.
Yeah.
And then just keeping track of as you go, because it's very easy to have that kind of explode out of control.
Yeah. Did you spend all of your startup up front, or did you save any?
So this is some universities, and I think you guys have had a session about negotiating jobs already. A lot of places actually have a forced time that you have to spend your startup, and a lot of times it's 3 years. And then at the end of those 3 years, it's just gone. But one of the things that I've heard, some advice I got from Kevin Campbell, who's at the University of Iowa, who's the chair of physiology there, and he told me that one of the mistakes he sees a lot is people try to save it. You want to save some. It's nice to have the unrestricted funds. You can go have lab retreats with it, and you can buy paper and printer ink with it.
Sure.
But the goal of that startup is to get the lab going.
Yeah.
And that means hiring people and buying the equipment and getting the data you need to get your first grant.
Yeah.
So I think, there's a balance to it. You don't want to spend foolishly, obviously. You want to buy the things that you're absolutely going to need. But don't hold back, because at the end of your tenure clock, if you say, yeah, I don't have any students and we only got a couple papers, but I got $500,000 left in my startup, they're going to say, why were you doing that?
Yeah.
Why didn't you spend it? So
Yeah.
I think from talking to a lot of my friends, that startups lasting for about 3 years is pretty normal.
Okay.
Of course, that depends on the amount of startup. Smaller schools with smaller startups, that of course is going to have to be scaled. But then mine lasted a little more than that, about 3.5 years or so.
Okay. So did you have any funding coming in to when you started as a faculty,
No.
or was it strictly startup?
Strictly startup.
So it's very important to negotiate a good startup.
Yeah, and I was very lucky in that my initial package was very reasonable and in line with other universities.
Okay.
I saw the question on here about,
Yeah.
do you need funding to get a job? Well, I'm here, so no. Does it help? Absolutely. In a perfect world, if you had 4 cell papers and a K-99, you could get any job you wanted, right? But it's not a requirement. I think it definitely helps in negotiating, but this idea that if you don't have this, you're sunk is just not true. And a number of my friends have gone on to get faculty positions at good places without having that funding.
Okay. Great. So you spoke a lot about when you first start getting that equipment, but hiring people because you need to start producing. So who did you hire first? Was it a lab tech? Was it a postdoc? Did you look for students? And how did you navigate that?
So my first hire was my lab manager, Kathy, who's
Okay.
wonderful. I don't think she's here, so I can say that. And she was a very senior level lab manager. She was here at the university for 18 years before she started with me. She had been in another lab that their funding lapsed, and so she was looking for a position.
Great.
I think it's the best thing I did
Okay.
because she now trains the other people in lab. She handles all the ordering. She keeps the lab going when I'm locked in a room writing.
Right.
And so that's been really, she handled all the OSHA and ULAM and all these things.
Okay.
It depends on the individual lab and what type of work they're doing. Some labs hire a brand new person out of college to be the lab manager, but the challenge there can be, those people are often en route somewhere else, right? They're
Yeah.
gonna lab tech for a year or two and then go to med school, or they're gonna do
Yeah.
something else. You know, I know that my lab manager, this is her career, this is what she wants to do, and so
Yeah.
that's been very nice. Of course, the other side of it is the cost is more, because
Yes.
it's a senior person, but
Yes.
I think if you compared the two and then said, is it worth this much to not have to train a person to do all these things and to just have it handled, in my opinion, it was worth it for me.
Okay. So after you hired Kathy, right? Who was the next hire?
So we got several undergraduates in right
Okay.
away. I am very aggressive about training undergraduates.
Okay.
We have excellent ones here, and they can help. They're a lot of work, you know, because a lot of them come in with little or no bench experience, but they can be very helpful. And then I got a graduate student right away in May.
Okay.
So we kind of had things sort of going
Okay.
at the time. And I got very lucky with the timing. He had done a number of rotations and was sort of onto that spring rotation.
Yeah.
And so he rotated and then joined the lab. So
Okay.
it's about the best case scenario, I think, in terms of getting a student in the lab. And this is another thing that Kevin Campbell had told me, because when I talked to him, he was visiting Duke and he was going through tenure decisions for his own department. And I asked him, you know, what are the mistakes? I was like you guys. I said, you know, what do you see? What are the things that people mess up? And
Yeah.
he said, not getting people in the lab right away, not getting a student.
Okay.
And so that was something I really wanted to do, and I think being very out there at recruiting events, right? People complain about not having students in their lab, but then when PIP's recruiting rolls through, you don't see them. Well, the best way to recruit students is to be there, be present, let them get to know you, show them that you're not some crazy monster, you know, actually show them that you're gonna have a supportive environment.
Yeah.
And then get them in. So that was, I had a graduate student start in May, a number of undergraduates over the course of that year.
Great.
And then it wasn't until year 2.5 or so that I started looking for postdocs.
Okay. So how much time did you spend physically at the bench when you started your lab?
Because I got a student right away,
Yep.
I made the conscious effort to train them so that they could do the bench work. And so one of my surprises starting a position is how quickly I've gone full on like PI in the lab alert mode, where they don't even want me in there because I don't know which end of a pipette goes where. I stopped pretty quickly.
Okay.
So I sort of trained them how to make neuronal cultures and how to do transfections and what they should be looking for. And it was a challenge at first, and I think they would say the same thing. There was a lot of trial and error. They were learning it for themselves, but the benefit is that now something needs done, and they all are the ones that know how to do it. And they have then gone on to train the people that have come in the lab after them. And so everyone has their own strategy, and that was the way I chose, and I think that's been very good for the lab, because I do have some friends now that love to be at the bench, but it's hard for them to then go give talks and write grants because they're the ones physically doing the experiments.
Yeah.
And they are not yet to the point where they can say to their lab, can you do these 3 things and I'll see you in a few days. And I think that's a challenge for them. But everything I say today, just imagine it says, in my opinion, before it or something. I think the best thing you can do is talk to a lot of people and figure out what your own strategy is going to be.
Great. So now I'd like to open the floor up for some questions. So I'll take some questions regarding like equipment, and hiring people and things such as that. Yeah.
My question is about hiring. What do you look for in people, choosing that first lab manager, which seems so critical? What do you gauge that on?
So I mean, all of you have worked in labs before, and you know the traits of the people that you've worked with that have worked best with you.
Yeah.
And so you really just try to get a feel for, how do you handle these things and how organized they are. I mean, obviously in a lab manager, that's very important. Somebody that's going to be organized, somebody that has that experience in handling budgets and equipment and orders and all these things. But the other thing is, don't be afraid to take advantage of these probationary periods, right? I mean, most places have a window during which you can hire somebody and then say, you know what, after 3 months, this isn't really working out. And it feels yucky, especially if you're wimpy about these things like I am, but it gets you out of a long-term commitment, because once somebody's been in your lab past that probationary period, especially at a place like this, it's very difficult to get rid of them unless there's some obvious cause. And so it's, first you just interview them and get a feel for their personality and their level of experience and whether that's going to fit for what you want to do, and then get them into the lab and have them interact with everybody and see if it's going to work long term, and if it's not, cut bait and move on.
And what about for students? How do you make those decisions? And do you make the decisions solely yourself, or do you rely on your lab to contribute?
Definitely rely on the lab too. Fitting into the group dynamic is incredibly important. In fact, to me, it may be the most important thing. If somebody comes in and they're an excellent student, but they don't get along with everyone and it's going to cause toxicity in the lab, it's a no-go from square one for me. So again, I think, you do the rotation and you see how they do within the rotation. You can get a feel for how engaged people are. I don't worry so much about technical experience. If they haven't done hippocampal cultures before, if they're driven and they're reading the literature and they're asking good questions and they're able to think on their feet, we can teach them those other things. But you can't teach drive, I don't think, or at least I haven't seen it very often.
Yeah.
But you can teach background and you can teach experiments. So you're looking for somebody who's really passionate. And I think in general in science, right, you want somebody, and including yourself, to be able to have that high of the experiment working, sustain you through that next period of sometimes miserable failure, right? And if you see that somebody who comes in and they're so excited about that positive result, to me that's a very, very good sign, because then that's a person that's going to have the drive to get all the way through the program.
Great.
About postdoc?
Postdocs? Yeah, it's the same idea, right? You're looking for somebody who's driven. It's a challenge for a new PI to get postdocs, because I didn't go to a brand new person's lab for a postdoc, and I did that for a reason. I went to a HHMI lab so that I had somebody whose letter was going to carry a lot of weight when I went to get hired. There are ways to do it. I do have 2 postdocs in my lab now. So the first is you find somebody who is geographically limited to be here, right? Somebody that their spouse or significant other is here and they need to stay here in Ann Arbor, and you say, look, I'm going to be in lab every day. My success is going to depend on you, and so we're both going to be, have vested interest in succeeding as much as possible, and that is good for them. So, being a new PI, and this is what I told the students as well, you're going to have your hand on everything your name on everything that comes through the door, because you'll be one of the first people in. And as a postdoc, that can overcome my low status in the field. If you come out with a bunch of papers, that's going to be fantastic for you. So that's one way, and then the other way is get a co-mentor. So both my postdocs are actually co-mentored by the chair of our department, and that way they sort of have the best of both worlds, right? They have her status and letter, and then they have me in lab every day saying, oh, this didn't work, let's take a look at it together.
Great. There's up here, yeah.
Do you have any recruiting strategies for new graduate students other than events? Like you post online forums?
So I haven't found job postings or anything online to be useful at all. You get like 300 emails where clearly they have put, they just replace the words, Dear Dr. Blank, my interest in nuclear magnetic resonance is clearly a fit for your lab studying cell biology. And they've even bolded the words that they delete and replace with the words from your lab website. And so to me, it hasn't been a useful thing, these online things, and you get, I mean, I get 10 of these a week, probably. So word of mouth from friends is a really good thing. You know, you have somebody that you know who just trained a PhD student, and you know that they're good, and you can put in a good word for them. In fact, my first student is getting ready to graduate, and he's already accepted a postdoc at UCSF through somebody that I know really well. And so I think word of mouth is very powerful. And then also just putting yourself out there at these events, especially for the students. It's the most powerful thing is explaining to them why their training matters to you, right? So they're not just hands in my lab. I have them work on grants. I have them work on rebuttals to the editor. I mean, things that oftentimes you don't get exposure to.
Yeah.
And I think they see that and say, okay, this hopefully will be a good training environment. I hope that it is. But I think that's valuable to them, that you're not just going to grind on them. Of course, we're going to work hard and we're going to try to succeed, but there are other things. You know, if you want to do career development things, that's great, because my goal is not to get that next paper and grant. My goal is for this person to move on and be successful, because to me, the biggest mark of success in science isn't that you got HHMI or you got some big grant. It's having just a flood of successful scientists that have come out of your lab and then have gone on to train their successful scientists, right? You have this tree of people. That is, I think, going to be ultimately, that's going to make more of a mark on science than however many papers I can publish myself or our lab can publish ourselves.
There were other questions, yes.
Do you ever feel that you would have done the budget management better if you had a prior experience or attended a workshop or had a conversation about it with your peer?
I think absolutely. I think there are a lot of things at the beginning that I could have done better with training. In Michigan, I think we're lucky that they do have launch committees for new faculty. So we meet every other month for the first year, and we talk about anything as trivial as where do I park on this silly campus to, you know, how should I hire or fire somebody. And so I was able to have some mentoring, sort of on-the-job mentoring from that launch committee, but it would be great, and I think OGPS is working to get you guys some exposure to these things now so that you don't have to learn so much on the fly. There's going to be a lot of learning on the fly regardless, but at least knowing, I mean, I came in, I didn't know what an indirect cost was. I mean, maybe I'm just an idiot, but I had no idea. And you know, they're like, oh, this percent indirect and this means this, and I had no idea. It was like Greek to me. So any exposure you can get to this now is really useful. And one of the ways you can do this, again, is just talk to people. Talk to your friends that have gotten jobs, talk to new assistant professors all the time. You're at departmental retreat, you're at seminar, you're waiting for the speaker to start. Just get advice from people. You know, what did you do? Like the things that you're asking me today, what would you have done differently? What would you do better, etc. And because if you get that advice from 20 people,
Yeah.
and 15 of them say the same thing, you know pretty well where to start.
Yeah. Great. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about like the timeline as far as in between like starting in your first day, getting the lab set up, to being like training students, as to like when you actually got your first experiments done in the lab? Like how much time elapsed between starting and getting your first experiments done?
So again, this starts with, in my opinion, but I have heard from a lot of my friends as well, the first year is rough. I think it was a year before we really felt like we're having lab meetings and data are coming out and we're being productive. And I've heard that from a lot of my friends. You go into this, I mean, if you've gotten to this point where you're in the job, then clearly you gave a good chalk talk. And in that good chalk talk, you said, I'm going to have these experiments that are shovel ready to do on day one, and then I'm going to have these experiments that are bigger picture, long-term things. And then what you're going to find out is all of that is garbage and nothing's going to work. And the things that are shovel ready fail. I've been growing this particular cell line for my entire scientific career. It took a year and a half to get them growing correctly. I ordered them from every place on earth. I changed media, I changed where we grew them, I did funny dances, like it didn't make any difference. And the part of my chalk talk that I gave where I said this is going to be my crazy pipe dream long-term thing is the first publication we had. So I think that's a very common thing. And so probably the best thing you can do is just be flexible about where the science takes you. You know, we knew this angle wasn't moving very quickly. We knew this was going to work out. It took us longer than I would have liked, but it's a great project, and now some of these other things are really moving too. But yeah, that I think a year for a lot of people, and the faster you can make that, the better. But what I appreciated is knowing going into it that a lot of my friends had the same experience. I didn't feel like, hey, let's make my imposter syndrome even worse for today than it already is. I thought, okay, this is kind of normal. Let's just try to do what we can to get through it.
Any more questions? Yeah.
How did you prioritize startup funds? I've been hired at basically a liberal arts institution, so my startup is not huge. I know I'm not going to be able to pay for everything I need to off the get-go. How do you kind of plan strategically for that?
And I think this ties into one of the other questions I saw, which is, prioritizing sharing equipment versus buying your own. What you have to do is you have to look at what are the things that I absolutely need to run my lab right now, to where if I had to share it and I couldn't get onto it on this Tuesday because somebody's using it, it would be devastating to me, and then buy those things. And then other things, centrifuges and all these things, if you're really having to prioritize, you can find those all over the place. Shared equipment that is going to be open, there are going to be lots of opportunities to get on, or shared reagents, or any of these things. I can borrow a tissue culture hood for a few hours a day if I have a friend that has some open space, but I can't borrow this piece of equipment. That's where I would put the money first. I mean, obviously you need the money to pay for people too. And so what you can do is get those people in and then have them aggressively applying for other sources of support. My personal belief is nobody's position should be contingent on that source of support, but if they get it, then fantastic, right? And then that's money that's freed up to do other things. So get the sort of bare minimum equipment you need, get the people in the lab to do the experiments, and then roll from there.
Yes.
Do you have a rough percentage how much you spend on human resources versus equipment, reagents, and
I think it's about half and half right now with monthly salary, maybe a little less on reagents and things, but something in that ballpark. And there are some very handy, I have a lot of friends who'll say, for every one FTE, for every one full-time employee, expect to spend $2,000 a month or something like that. And I don't know exactly what ours is, but you can maybe get a feel from friends doing similar, because of course it obviously depends on the type of work. If you're doing crazy RNA-seq and it's $1 million or whatever, you need to know that. So go to your friends and find out what they're spending. But I think that's a good way to think of it as number of full-time people, because obviously if you have 10 people doing experiments, that's gonna be a lot more expensive than 2 people. And someone back there.
Yeah.
Can you talk about with your favor of using students up front and contrast that to, like, say, a paid technician, not for a lab manager, but to actually do your experiments directly?
I think that could work really well also. I mean, the nice thing about a paid technician is that that's their job. For me, I think for tenure purposes, it's very nice to get students, especially students from your home department, because your mentoring and training is going to factor into the tenure decision in most places. So the technician is nice in that presumably you're hiring somebody with experience in the things that you want to have done in the lab, and so maybe they can roll out some things more quickly, so that would be good. I think either one could work well, and it probably depends a lot on the type of work going in the lab. I do think, I wish we could have gotten something out earlier, because one of the things that's a struggle at the beginning is proving that you've carved out your niche, right? You say, I'm going to do all these things, and you get the job based on it, and then you apply for a grant, and they say, yeah, but you're just Van Bennett's postdoc. And I've gotten those comments, even on my most recent grant. And so you have to carve that out, and even having a lower impact journal publication, that's something I probably would have done differently, and I had intended to, right? So talking back about having the cell culture model was going to be the first thing we did, that was the goal, was to bang out a JBC paper or something and say, okay, I'm me now, now we can apply for things. And so I wish that would have happened differently, but I'm happy with where we are now. But that's something I think I would recommend, is if you can, get your name out there as soon as possible. We wrote a review, and we wrote some commentaries, and we had some collaborative papers, but having that thing where the grant reviewers can't say, oh, but can this person really do it on their own? It would be really nice, and a tech could perhaps help with that.
Great. One more question? Yeah.
How do you manage time, like your daily time on the first week's month? Like, how much time do you spend organizing, setting the lab versus writing grants, or Because it's a whole new like payment.
Yeah. The beginning it's really sort of weird because you go from the end of your postdoc where you're grinding every day, and then you're like waiting for reagents to come in, and so it actually feels kind of nice at the beginning because you're like, so I guess I'm just going to go to Summerfest or something. For a little bit. And obviously, I was working on at the very beginning. There are a lot of these sort of clicky new investigator grants that are good to apply for, and so getting the data that can help you apply for those would be good because I think one of the things with funding is if you can get a small grant, an internal grant, a small foundation grant, that's one sign to people that you can then do it on your own. And then you can parlay that into a bigger grant, and then you go to apply for your R1 and they say, hey look, all these other people have vetted this person and they think they're good. So that would be a good place to spend some time sort of balancing it between generating those critical preliminary data that you need for your first R1 or whatever large grant you're applying for, and then writing some of those because some of them have very limited windows. A lot of them are 3 years is the limit.
Yeah.
Some are 10 years post PhD, so you just have to balance. I made a spreadsheet of all the grants and when they were due, and I get a lot of them from Twitter as well. I'm pretty active on science Twitter, and they're very useful because you have a bunch of friends that study the same thing.
Yeah.
And then they say, oh, have you applied for this grant? And you're like, oh, yeah, I knew about that. And you go write it down. And a lot of people use NewPI Slack to do that as well. I signed up for that. I don't understand it at all, so I haven't been using it. But a lot of people say it's very useful. But Twitter has been good for that. And just make a spreadsheet, and then that way you can keep track. I've got one that's due in 2 weeks, and I've got one that's due in 6 weeks. So in between, I can work on generating some new data and try to get people in the lab, et cetera.
No, this is actually a great transition because I wanted to now start talking about funding. So you talked about, you started your lab, you had your startup funds, but there was a time limit on the startup funds.
There was not a time.
Oh, it was not a time limit.
It's just that's when it disappeared.
Okay, that's when it disappeared. But I guess theoretically, once the startup funds are gone, you need other funds from your own funding. So when
that's what they keep telling me.
So when did you start applying for grants? If you could just maybe tell us a little bit about that process. And when did you start becoming successful getting those grants?
So I was driving to put an R01 in within the first 6 months of being here. And my launch committee stopped me.
Okay.
And I'm glad that they did because we didn't have the preliminary. We had this idea that this particular variant was going to impact circuitry, and we had made a mouse with this mutation. We had no data yet on the mouse. We had a bunch of in vitro stuff that in my mind would have been okay, but it would have probably been too preliminary. And the risk is that if you apply without the data you need, that you get a reputation. And then they see that grant again later and they go, oh God, this guy again,
Okay.
That's not to say, I do have friends that have applied within their first year and gotten their grant right away. So I think a lot of it depends on the stage of your data. If you brought a a project that's well thought out and has a lot of data, then maybe it'll fly sooner. So I'm certainly not saying, don't tell your chairs that I told you don't apply in the first year. But in my case, we waited a little bit.
Okay.
And in the meantime, I applied for a zillion of these small grants, internal grants. I've been in with 4 R1s so far. None of them have been funded, so that's been difficult. But we got our first grant. I should say we, not I. The lab got our first big grant this past year. We just got the money in December, basically, from the One Mind organization, which is a mental health research organization. And so this is one of the sort of early career type things that I had applied for. And that was the first thing that we've had success with, was that grant.
Excellent. So how did you deal with failure?
It's tough.
Yeah.
And I think I was talking to my students yesterday about the question, what has been the biggest surprise? And I knew that science was up and down. I knew that you're going to get knocked down. You got to pick yourself up and dust yourself off. To me, the biggest surprise has been how many times you oscillate between those things, even in a week. And the lows are pretty low. But then the highs are super, super exciting. I love my job. If you gave me a choice to do anything else tomorrow, I would choose this again. But the lows are tough. And so I vent with my friends who are all going through the same thing. Again, Twitter has been super useful. I have a group of people that we all interact, and most of them I only know electronically, although I met a bunch of them at a meeting just a couple months ago.
Yeah.
It's nice to have friends going through the same thing, because again, you see that this is normal. You know, this is the way that it is. It's tough to get funding right now. It's tough for everybody. But yeah, I have support at home, and I have supportive friends, and that has been the way to get through it. And you know, I think the best advice I ever got in my career was from my PhD mentor, and he said, just do good science, right? And it's easy to say, just do good science, but I can't control the NIH pay lines, and I can't control who reviews my grants. So if we just keep doing good science, stuff will work out. And of course, there's obviously a survivorship bias to this, right? I'm here, and so I'm the one saying that, and there are other people where it hasn't worked out, and they wouldn't say the same thing. But I do think that in general, spending a lot of energy worrying about, oh, what if the government shuts down? What if the pay line's worse? All these things doesn't change any of it. So spend your effort on things you can change, I think is probably the thing that's helped me deal with it the most.
Great. So, reflecting on starting your own lab, what are 3 things that you would do differently?
Well, 3 things.
If you had the chance. Or maybe a few things.
I mean, certainly, I think, like I said, trying to get a publication out sooner would be something. And that is not a reflection of the people in my lab or anything. That was a reflection of just the way the dice roll. And, you know, we got lucky on some things, got very unlucky on others. I kind of stick by the other things that we've done. But what I would say is the things I do recommend that I did do is network a lot at the beginning. So our department has a seminar series where we can invite speakers from around the country, and I made a real effort to split my invitations into 2 groups. Very senior people who may or may not be on study section or may not be editors of journals, and people that were getting ready to go up for tenure that were in the same area as me. And the idea is you want to have on your CV as many invited talks as you can. And if you invite somebody who's in year 5 or 6, and then they have this warm, fuzzy feeling about you, and then they go, you know who we should invite this year is that person who invited me. And sure enough, I've been getting talk invitations to go to these places. So I think that's really helped. And that was another thing that Kevin Campbell had told me is one of the other mistakes he sees first year people make is they stop going to national meetings because they feel like they don't have enough data. But you have to get your name out there as quickly as you can. And even if it's, you know, a few pieces of new data, give talks at meetings, you know, invite yourself. Don't be afraid to put yourself out there and say, hey, you know, I saw this session and we just started our lab, and I've had really great luck with people. Everyone's looking for new and exciting stuff. You know, so when I'm co-chairing one of the FASB summer conferences next year, I would kill for somebody to email me and say, hey, I got a new angle on home dilation. I really would love to present. Great. That's one less person I have to invite, right? So don't be afraid to offer yourself up. Hey, you know, if you've got a seminar series next year and you're looking for somebody, I'd be happy to come out and do it. And what's the worst they're going to say is, okay, yeah, great. We'll keep you in mind. And then they never contact you if they don't have a spot, or they do. So I think that networking, getting yourself out there, getting your name is really important, because that's going to make a big difference when you go, when you're writing papers and you're writing grants and they say, oh, I remember that person we met at the meeting. It's all very helpful.
Do we have any questions about the transition process in general? Yes?
So how important are publications in order to get that first R1?
Again, I think there's no black and white answer. Having them is better than not having them. I have friends who got an R1 without one, but I think your odds go way up with having one. Our 4 R1s that we submitted, we did not yet have our first primary research publication yet. So this one that we're working on now for February will be the first one where that paper is in, and we can say, hey, look, we did do bioarchive for the last submission. I mean, I do think that has been a useful thing. Although I learned an important lesson, which was they will not look at your bioarchive paper at all. So if you have data, just citing that paper is not sufficient. They will not look at it, and then they will say, well, he doesn't have the data to show that he can do these things. So cite it, and they did mention under the investigator, you know, doesn't have a publication yet, but has a bioarchive. Clearly it's en route to being a publication as a strength. So I think, depending on the study section, they are looking at it. So get those things out there. I don't think there are a lot of risks to preprints. You know, the chances that somebody is going to find that and reproduce everything you did and scoop you completely is pretty small, I would think.
Yeah.
Of course, it depends on the project and you know how hot the area is.
Yeah. Yes.
How important are collaborations in your experience?
I am a collaborator by nature. I like collaborating a lot. We have had positive comments on our grants in the strength section about having publications, even though they weren't primary, you know, with me as senior author. So we had a PNAS and a JCI paper with collaborators, one here, one at Hopkins, and that's been a great experience. It helps my trainees. The longer your CV is, the better, right? Even if you're middle author, that's okay. Fill it up with great papers, and it's going to help. And collaborations are a good way to do that. So I think it benefits you, and it benefits your trainees, as long as it doesn't cut into your own primary research angle, right? I mean, you don't want to do it at the expense of your own research, but if you can do it at the same time, that's fantastic.
I saw a head here.
Yeah. So how do you weigh, like, in terms of publication, do you prefer to publish a small story for multiple publication, or put all data together into high impact journal?
Yeah, it's $1 million question. If you can publish what my postdoc mentor called base hits, right? You can publish 3 base hits. JBC paper, asks a question, answers it, raises a new question, then you answer that one in the next publication, and you answer the next one. I think a lot of people will look at that very positively. You answer all those 3 questions together in a cell paper, the same thing. So I think a lot of times people get really hung up on the impact factor to their detriment. If they're going to make you jump through a billion hoops, just get it out. I have had every piece of advice on this topic. Get it out, or do everything in your power to get the high profile paper. I would say more people tell me to just get it out than the alternative.
Yeah.
But the director of NIMH at this early career thing last year said, in his career he waited, and he knew it was a big story, and it took him longer than he wanted, and he got it. Of course, it was somewhere huge, but so again, it's his own bias. That's the way he did it, so that's the way he thinks you should do it. So it just depends, I think.
I saw some heads.
Do you feel, this is a personal question, but do you feel you've made any sacrifices in your personal life to get to where you're at? Or have you not and been able to be successful? Or I guess, what are your thoughts on making sacrifices in your personal life? And sometimes you probably should, and it's good, but there are other areas in your life that you shouldn't and can't. So what do you have to say about that?
So I would say that I've been really lucky to not have to have made too many sacrifices. My wife has been very supportive. She's had a job that was able to be, maybe not the exact job, but she's been able to keep her career and move places with me, but it was certainly a source of stress. It was certainly a source of her feeling bad sometimes. And that was very difficult. We have 2 kids, I have 2 daughters, and I try to not make sacrifices there as much as possible. I saw a question about how many hours do you work. I tend to work pretty normal business hours. I tend to not come in on weekends as much as possible. When it's grant season, I'll probably be in. And maybe that will be what makes me fail. And if that's the case, then so be it, because I'm not going to risk those other things. I'm not going to miss my kids growing up for this job.
And so far, so good, so I think.
I'm here now,
really
so, talk to me in 3 years or so, and we'll see. But, I mean, certainly, I get home later than I would like, which is, not that late. I get home at 6:30, but my kids go to bed at 7:30. Would I love to see them more than that? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But that's why the weekend time for me is sort of their time for the most part. But yeah, trying to work 2 people through this system of having to yank up your life and move was very difficult, and I've been very lucky that my wife has been willing to do that. She worked at Google when we were here, when I was a grad student. That's a very tough thing to ask somebody to leave, right? I mean, this was sort of, this is like part of her identity when she was here working for Google, and then I'm like, okay, well, so here's what we're gonna do. If you're okay with it, we're gonna move to North Carolina, and I'm going to start this job where only 15% of people succeed after it. How's that sound? Not very good? Okay, let's talk some more about it. You know, so it was a challenge, but I think the biggest thing is you do you. You know, I have a lot of friends who are lab rats and they like to be in lab. That's their home.
Yeah.
And I don't think shaming them is any better than shaming people that are here during normal business hours. And if you like being here, then be here. And if you don't, then don't.
Yeah.
And, you know, everyone has to make their own personal decisions about where their priorities lie. And I mean, I love this job and I work hard at it, but I'm not going to be here just to say I was here. And I'm not going to take time away from my family as much as I can.
Great. So unfortunately, we have to wrap up because it's getting close to the end, but thank you so much, Paul, for this faculty corner. If we can give him a round of applause.
And if people have things that they want to meet and talk about, the coffee shop's right there. You know, my email is on the PIP site. You know, feel free to email me because I think the more people you talk to during these transitions, the better. And we'll grab a coffee and chat.
Thank you.